There are two types of fantasy writers: those who finish their novels and those who don't. You know exactly what I mean. Some fantasy writers start strong. They build their worlds, outline their story, create characters they love, only to never see any real story words hitting the page. Some manage to get started for real, and get stuck rewriting their opening chapters over and over, convinced that this time it will finally click. And the rest? Well, they have full of half-finished drafts, world-building notes, and plot ideas that never become a single finished story. For years, I was one of them. I thought the problem was me, that I wasn't disciplined enough, that I needed to write faster, that I just wasn't meant to finish a novel. But in 25 years of writing fantasy, I've learned something that changed everything for me. And it's the reason I finally started finishing the stories that mattered most. Finishing a novel isn't about writing faster. And it's definitely not about spending years developing a world that never makes it to the page. It's about having the right framework, a system that doesn't just organize your ideas, but actually guides your creativity toward the finish line. That's exactly what I built for myself over the last years. When I applied this framework to my latest novel, The Fugitive Prince, it cut my writing time by months. Not because I rushed through the process, but because I knew exactly what needed to happen next. I wasn't second guessing every scene. I wasn't stuck reworking the same chapters over and over. If you've ever felt stuck in the middle of your novel, overwhelmed by your own ideas, or unsure how to turn your world into a complete story, then keep watching. Because what I'm about to share with you might be the exact thing you've been missing. What I didn't realize myself years ago was that the reason my stories kept falling apart had nothing to do with plots, my world building, or even my writing skill. It was because my characters weren't making choices that truly mattered. Think about it for a moment. What is it that makes some fantasy characters stay with us long after we close the book, while others fade from memory within days? That question haunted me through my first decade of writing fantasy. I spent years world building, outlining plots, and crafting backstories, only to realize that no matter how much detail I added, my characters still felt flat. They moved through my worlds like actors reciting lines, rather than real people making choices that mattered. I thought the solution was more planning, more detail, more layers. So I spent weeks mapping out character arcs, designing personality traits, and writing pages of backstory. But when I sat down to write, something was still missing. And then came the novel that nearly made me quit writing altogether. I had a protagonist I loved, a young mage with a tragic past, rare magical abilities, and a destiny to save her world. On paper, she had everything a great fantasy hero needed from me at that time. But every time I tried to write her story, it fell flat. The scenes felt empty, the dialogue felt forced, the words were there, but the soul wasn't. And one night, after another frustrating writing session, I did something unexpected. Instead of working on my novel, I pulled out an old journal. The kind filled with raw, unfiltered thoughts from years earlier. And that's when it hit me. These scribbled journal entries, filled with real fears, small victories, and personal doubts, felt more alive than anything I had written in my novel. Why? Because they weren't about big events. They were about moments that mattered to the character emotionally, to myself. The fear of disappointing someone, the joy of a friend's unexpected kindness, the quiet uncertainty of facing the unknown. This made me realize something that completely transformed my approach to writing. I had been so focused on creating grand destinies and intricate backstories that I missed the heart of what makes characters unforgettable: their choices. Not just the small everyday details, but the moments when they are forced to confront what they truly believe, the choices that define who they are and change their story forever. So the next morning, I threw out my character sheets and started asking different questions. Instead of listing personality traits, I asked what decision would challenge my protagonist's deepest values? What fear could force them to grow or break them completely? What choice would haunt them long after the story moves on? And that is when everything changed. Instead of forcing my characters through plot points, I let them face choices that made a difference, choices that revealed who they truly were. Take my protagonist Storm from my upcoming novel The Fugitive Prince, a story shaped entirely by the framework I'm sharing with you in this video. In the early chapters, there is a moment where he has to choose between fleeing the palace after being betrayed by his father, or staying to fight for the woman he loves. The very woman who, at that moment, is being dragged away in chains. At first, I wrote this as a tactical decision. Stay and risk death, or escape and live to fight another day. It made sense on a plot level, but I didn't feel the character's struggle or the emotion of the moment. Then I applied what I had learned. Instead of just asking, what should he do? I asked, what does this choice mean to him? Suddenly, it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about a man who had spent his entire life being told that his duty was to protect those he loved, now forced to abandon the one person he swore he would never leave behind. It was about someone who had been raised to stand and fight, realizing in the worst possible moment that the only way to save the woman he loves was to let her go. His instincts told him to die fighting. His heart demanded he stay, but if he threw away his life now, she would be lost forever. The external choice remained exactly the same, but the emotional weight behind it changed everything. And that emotional weight rippled through the rest of the story. Storm's later struggles with trust, his reluctance to embrace leadership, his complicated relationship with power. These didn't come from an outline. They grew naturally from that single choice and the scars it left behind. The more I focused on emotional truth rather than plot mechanics, the easier the writing became. I didn't need to consult character sheets in the same way as before anymore. I knew how my characters would react because they had become real people to me. And that revealed something crucial to me. In fantasy, we obsess over world building, magic systems, and complex plots. But those things aren't what makes a fantasy novel unforgettable. They are just the stage. The real magic happens when we use that stage to explore human emotion, fear, hope, love, or sacrifice. That's what makes readers fall in love with a story. And if you ever wondered how to structure those emotionally charged moments in your own story, I break it all down in my free Emotional Weight Point starter kit. I'll tell you more about how to grab it in just a bit. Because those choices were just the beginning. After I transformed my characters, I discovered another hidden problem, one that had been holding my stories back for years. I had spent so much time building my worlds that I never stopped to ask, is my world actually shaping my characters in a meaningful way? That realization led me to my next major breakthrough, one that completely changed how I approach fantasy world building since then. I used to believe that great fantasy worlds were built from the ground up, starting with maps, history, magic systems, and cultures, until I had something so detailed it could rival a real civilization. So I spent months world building. I had notebooks filled with timelines stretching back thousands of years. I designed complex economies, political factions, and mystical orders, some of which never even appeared in my stories. And yet none of it mattered when I actually sat down to write. Because no matter how much effort I put into my worlds, the stories I set within them still felt hollow. The conflict was there, the lore was rich, but there was something still missing. At first, I thought the problem was detail. I wasn't adding enough, so I spent even more time refining my magic systems, perfecting my fictional cultures, and expanding my histories. But no matter how much more I added, the stories still fell flat. Then one day, I looked back at some of my favorite fantasy novels, the ones that had kept me awake late into the night, and I noticed something shocking. The depth of their world building wasn't what made them memorable. It was how that world shaped its characters and their choices. And that realization defined my next breakthrough. For years, I had treated world building as something separate from storytelling, as a layer of detail that I needed to establish before writing, but I had it completely backward. The most compelling fantasy worlds don't just exist, they create conflict. They force characters to make impossible choices. They dictate what is and isn't possible. They set the rules that characters must navigate, struggle against, and sometimes break. This realization came to me in pieces, but one of the moments that solidified it was during the early stages of writing a novel where magic played a central role. I had spent weeks refining its mechanics, ensuring it had strict limitations and a well-balanced cast. I thought that by making the magic system perfect, I was making my world stronger. But then I noticed something. My magic system existed, but it wasn't doing anything for the story. It was there, a tool my characters used, but not something that actually challenged them. So I asked myself a new question. What if magic wasn't just a system, but a source of conflict? And suddenly, a new puzzle piece clicked. Instead of just creating rules for how magic worked, I started asking, how does this magic change the people who use it? What fear does society have around it? What consequences does it create, not just for those who wield it, but for those around them? Instead of being just another element of the setting, magic became something that divided nations, sparked wars, and corrupted those who relied on it too heavily. It forced characters to make choices that mattered. But more importantly, I realized this applied to everything in world building. Magic, history, politics, geography. None of these things should just exist in your world. They should be forces that actively shape your character's struggles. Let me give you an example. In an earlier novel, I had created a setting where a vast empire ruled over smaller conquered nations. It had all the hallmarks of classic fantasy world building. Rich history, a neat system of governance, trade disputes, and noble families vying for power. But when I looked at my protagonist, I found something that went against everything I had learned by now. This grand empire I had designed had no real impact on them. The very character that was supposed to be a cornerstone of my story. I had created a backdrop, not conflict. So I went back and asked myself the critical question: how does this world make my characters' lives harder? And suddenly, the entire story changed. Instead of just existing in this empire, my protagonist became someone shaped by it. Someone who had spent their life under the weight of its rule, forced to follow laws that weren't made for them, torn between loyalty to their homeland and the opportunities the empire provided. Now, instead of the world being a passive setting, it was an active force, a system that pushed my character into difficult decisions, creating internal and external conflict at every turn. And that's when I developed what I now call conflict-first world building. Instead of building a world first and then trying to fit a story into it, I now start with the story and ask, what world would make this character's struggles even harder? How does this setting create tension in their relationships? What laws, traditions, or beliefs would challenge what they want? Because a fantasy world isn't defined by how much detail it has, if you ask me. It's defined by how much it shapes the story being told within it. And once I started building my worlds around conflict, everything about my writing became easier. Scenes had more tension, choices had more weight. Even dialogue felt more natural because characters weren't just talking, they were navigating the unspoken rules of their world, the same way we do in real life. And the best part? It saved me months of preparation time, allowing me to start writing my stories much quicker. Instead of designing cultures and magic systems that might never impact the story, I was focusing only on the details that actually mattered. Now, every kingdom, every piece of lore, every rule of magic I create serves a purpose: to push my characters into the kinds of choices that reveal who they truly are. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: the best world building isn't about depth, it's about impact. But even after I transformed my world building, not all problems were solved yet. I had a setting that created meaningful conflict, and I had characters who were shaped by the world. But my scenes still weren't presenting themselves the way I wanted them to. Some scenes landed with power, others just were there. For years I had believed that if I got my characters right and my world building strong, this story would naturally take shape. But I was wrong here, and at first I couldn't figure out why. It wasn't about stakes, there were plenty. It wasn't about detail either, my worlds had more than enough depth. And it wasn't about planning, because I had spent years refining how I structured my stories. But the books that kept me awake late into the night, they had something I wasn't seeing in my own work. And it wasn't until I stepped back and analyzed my own failed drafts, along with some of my favorite fantasy novels, that I noticed the pattern and discovered another puzzle piece. It was never just about the big decisions. It was about how different types of conflict layered together, forcing characters into situations where every choice carried weight. This was the moment I discovered what I now call the conflict triangle. A way of understanding how external challenges, interpersonal struggles, and internal dilemmas weave together to create stories that feel alive. Early on, I thought conflict was about the big external challenges: wars, betrayals, battles, political intrigue. But when I studied some of my absolute favorite stories, I realized the most compelling moments didn't come from external threats alone. They came from the way those external conflicts intertwined with a character's relationships and internal struggles. For every choice had ripple effects across all three levels of conflict. Here's what that looks like. As external conflict, we have the immediate visible challenge, such as a war, an assassination attempt, or a looming catastrophe. Then we have the interpersonal conflict, the way that challenge strains relationships, that manifests in friendships being tested, loyalties broken, or trust shattered. And finally, then we have the internal conflict, although challenge forces the protagonist to confront their deepest fears, values, and their sense of identity. The best stories weren't separating these conflicts, they were colliding them. Let me show you how this plays out in The Fugitive Prince. There's a pivotal moment in the story where Storm makes a choice that defines the rest of his journey. He's on the run after the attempt on his life, hunted by the very soldiers he once fought beside. Along the way, he and his companions reach a village suffering under his father's increasingly ruthless rule. On the surface, the conflict seems clear. He needs to stay hidden to avoid capture. But then, these people need help. In early drafts, I treated this as a simple external dilemma. Does he risk exposing himself by stepping in? Or does he stay hidden knowing that intervening will draw attention? But when I stepped back and applied the conflict triangle, I realized this scene wasn't just about a tactical decision. Because for Storm, this wasn't just any village. This was a place where his father had once been respected, a part of the very kingdom Storm had been raised in, raised to believe in duty, honor, and loyalty to the crown. Not long ago, he would have been the one ordered to lead these soldiers, enforcing the very laws that were now being used to break these people. So helping them wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a rejection of everything he had been raised to be and to believe in. Instead of a simple risk versus safety scenario, this scene gained 3 different layers. First, there's the interpersonal tension. The villagers didn't trust him. In disguise, he was just a stranger, and if he'd reveal himself, he would be the Sun's King bound by blood to the very oppressors these people now faced. Then there was the internal struggle. For Storm, helping the villagers wasn't just about the risk of exposure, it meant letting go of the last shred of loyalty he had to his father. The moment he stepped forward, he wasn't just a prince on the run anymore, he was committing to a path of rebellion. And lastly, there was still the external danger, of course. His action wouldn't just risk drawing attention, they'd guarantee it. The moment he would intervene, he'd put a target on not just himself, but everyone else in the village. The guards would likely come back in greater numbers, and these people would pay the price for his choices. This layering of conflict transformed what had been an interesting scene into a pivotal moment of transformation. One where the battle wasn't just against soldiers, but against everything that had defined who Storm was up to this point. And once I understood this, I started to see it everywhere. I went back through my drafts, and the most powerful moments in my stories, whether I had planned them that way or not, were the ones where all 3 types of conflict were colliding. The external battles weren't just exciting action sequences, they carried emotional weight because they affected trust, love, fear, and identity. The betrayals didn't just hurt because they changed alliances, they hurt because they forced characters to redefine who they were. And the moral dilemmas weren't just theoretical questions, they shaped the characters' future choices in ways that carried long-term consequences. This is why some stories feel flat despite high stakes, because the different layers of conflict are handled separately rather than woven together. Once I understood this, so much changed. Suddenly I wasn't just planning plot points, I was crafting moments where external threats, relationships, and inner turmoil crashed into each other. Scenes that had felt functional now felt alive. And for the first time in my writing career, I knew I had found something fundamental about how great stories work. This realization became the 3rd core pillar of my fantasy writing framework, a structured way to approach storytelling that ensures every major scene doesn't just advance the plot, but deepens character and emotional impact. Now when I build a scene, I don't just ask what happens, I ask what external challenge is forcing a choice. How does that choice affect relationships? And what does this moment force the protagonist to confront within themselves? Because when all 3 of these things collide, readers don't just watch the story happen, they feel it. But as great as all this sounds, even after I discovered this, one final challenge remained. Because having a loose idea about emotional depth, world building, and conflict just wasn't enough yet. I still needed a repeatable process, a way to structure my novels so that I never got lost in the middle of writing again. And that's when I developed the scene map technique, the final piece of the puzzle that brought everything together. Now, it didn't happen all at once. At the time, I was struggling with yet another attempt at one of my stories. I had all the right elements, character depth, meaningful world building, and layered conflict. But somehow I was still losing track of the story's momentum. My pacing felt uneven, some sections were too slow while others rushed past moments that should have been powerful. So one night, I tried something different. I stopped writing and laid out every major emotional moment in my story, every turning point, every painful choice, every scene that truly mattered. Not just the big climactic moments, but the deeply personal ones. The quiet decisions, the ones that shaped my protagonist in ways even he didn't fully understand. Then, I started mapping out what needed to happen before and after each of these moments. What emotions needed to build up beforehand to make the decision feel inevitable? What ripple effects would this choice create in the following scenes? How would it alter the relationship between characters? How would it change the way my protagonist saw himself? And suddenly, everything clicked. I realized that every emotional waypoint, every moment of transformation needed this type of 3-scene structure to fully land. A setup scene where tension builds and stakes are made clear, a choice scene where the character is forced to make a meaningful decision, and an aftermath scene where we feel the consequences of that choice ripple through the story. That's when I saw the missing piece. I hadn't been struggling with plot, I had been struggling with emotional pacing. I had been treating key moments like isolated islands, rather than recognizing them as part of a living, breathing journey. Some of my most powerful scenes lacked proper build-up, which meant they didn't hit as hard as they should have. Others had no clear aftermath, which meant their impact faded too quickly. Once I applied this to every emotional waypoint, my stories transformed. Scenes no longer felt disconnected. The story flowed naturally from one moment to the next. And most importantly, I stopped second-guessing myself because I knew exactly what needed to happen next. But what really shocked me was what happened when I started sharing this framework with other writers. It added real value to them right away. Suddenly they weren't trying to fix their writing. They were just following the natural flow of their story's emotional journey. And that's why I built this into a full framework, a system designed to help fantasy writers finish their novels without getting stuck or overwhelmed. Now, whenever I start a new book, I don't worry about whether I'll finish, because I know exactly how to structure my scenes, how to build my world around meaningful conflict, and how to craft characters that make choices that matter. For years, I had personally resisted structure. I thought it would box me in, limit my storytelling. But what it had actually done was remove the biggest barrier standing between me and creative flow: uncertainty. The reason I had struggled for so long wasn't because I lacked ideas or skill, it was because I had spent too much time questioning my story instead of experiencing it. Once I had the scene map in place, once I had built my world around meaningful conflict, once I had defined the emotional weight behind every key moment, I didn't have to stop and think about what came next. To me, flow isn't the absence of effort, it's the absence of resistance. The reason so many writers struggle to finish their novels isn't because they aren't creative or disciplined enough, because they are constantly stopping themselves mid-process. They hit a difficult scene and start questioning their choices. They lose momentum and assume something is wrong with their story. They get caught in an endless loop of rewriting because they don't trust the draft they just wrote. And every time that happens, they pull themselves out of the story. They disrupt their own flow. But when you remove that resistance, when you trust the framework you've built, when you let your characters make choices instead of forcing them into plot points, when you let your world shape the story instead of just decorating it, writing becomes something else entirely. It becomes immersive, it becomes natural, it becomes inevitable. And that's what this framework did for me. It didn't just help me structure my novel, it made writing feel right. It turned writing sessions from a battle into an exploration. One where I already knew the path forward, but where I still got to experience the journey as I wrote. So if you've ever felt stuck yourself, if you've ever struggled to bring your fantasy novel to life, such a framework could do the same for you. And if you've made it this far, you already know that something in this framework speaks to you. Maybe because, like me, you've struggled to bring your ideas to life. Maybe because you've started novels that never reached the final page. Or maybe because deep down, you know your story deserves better than to stay trapped in your head. For that, I put together the Emotional Waypoint Starter Kit, a free guide to help you plan your story's most crucial moments, so you never feel lost in your draft again. This is the exact starting point I wish I had when I struggled to turn ideas into finished fantasy novels. So if you're finally ready to stop second guessing your story and start making real progress, click the link in the description below to sign up for my free newsletter and grab your copy of the Emotional Waypoint Starter Kit. Don't let another day go by where your story is waiting to be told. Instead, act today and finally bring it to life. The world is waiting for what you have to offer.